Sourdough is everywhere again. People name their starters, track feeding ratios, compare crumb photographs, and trade recipes across social media. But on the American frontier, sourdough was not a hobby arranged around a convenient afternoon. It was a living piece of household infrastructure. If the starter weakened, the bread changed. If the flour was poor, the dough exposed it. If the oven was misread, a day's work could turn black outside and remain raw within. Before sourdough became a trend, it fed the frontier because somebody in the household knew how to keep the entire system alive. A frontier loaf often began when the day's other work was ending. The fire had been banked, water had been carried, animals had been seen to, then a portion of living starter was mixed with more flour and water to make a sponge. The exact method varied by place and household. Some bakers maintained what we would recognize as sourdough. Others used brewer's barm, hop yeast, potato yeast, or a piece of dough saved from an earlier baking. Commercial manufacture of yeast specifically for bakers did not begin until around 1870. Before a store could sell a dependable cake of yeast, a baker had to maintain fermentation at home, or obtain it from somebody who did. What lived in the crock was a working community of yeast and acid-producing bacteria. The yeast released carbon dioxide that expanded inside the dough. The bacteria produced the acids that gave the bread its character and helped shape which organisms could survive in the culture. Frontier bakers did not need a microscope to understand the partnership. They watched what the starter did. That made the starter different from an ordinary ingredient. Flour disappeared as it was eaten. Salt had to be replaced. A healthy culture renewed itself. The baker removed what was needed, fed what remained, and carried the household's ability to raise bread into another week. And sourdough did not always become the round, deeply scored loaf now displayed online. The same culture could leaven flapjacks, biscuits, muffins, cakes, or whatever form fit the available fuel and time. A household could set a sponge at night and turn part of it into a quick breakfast before committing the rest to bread. That flexibility mattered. The starter was not maintained for one prized recipe. It supported an entire family of foods. There was no universal frontier starter sealed in a standardized jar. Families inherited different cultures, fed them with different flours, and adjusted them to local conditions. A crock might remain near the warmth of the kitchen, protected from a hard freeze but watched so it did not overheat. The real possession was not the container, it was continuity. By morning, the sponge had to be judged. Historical instructions from Western Army bakehouses describe a sponge fermenting for 6 to 8 hours, until it had risen and begun to fall. Wait too long and the resulting bread could turn flat, heavy, and sharply sour. Use it too early, and it might not have enough strength to lift the dough. That judgment was complicated by weather. Fermentation moved faster in a warm kitchen and slower in a cold cabin. A crock placed near a stove might become too warm. One left against an outside wall in winter might barely move. The baker learned the signs instead of expecting the clock to deliver the answer. A ripe sponge changed in volume. Bubbles worked across the surface. The smell became active and pleasantly fermented rather than stale or rotten. The batter loosened as organisms consumed available food. These changes told the baker when to add the remaining water, salt, and flour. Modern recipes can specify a room temperature, a feeding ratio, and an exact number of hours. Frontier instructions often assumed something more difficult to print. The person reading them already knew what living dough looked like. That knowledge was usually learned by standing beside another baker, not by reading measurements from a page. The flour itself could change the entire day. Before modern milling and national brands made flour more uniform, a barrel might contain wheat of a different variety, age, moisture level, or milling quality than the barrel before it. 19th century bakers tested flour with their hands. Good flour was expected to cling slightly when squeezed, hold its shape, and work into dough that felt elastic rather than sticky and weak. Much of the flour used before roller milling became dominant in the 1880s also retained more of the grain. Bran and germ affected how flour absorbed water and how the dough developed. A baker could not assume that yesterday's amount of water would be correct today. So, flour was added by feel. The dough was worked until it became smooth enough to handle and strong enough to hold the gas produced during fermentation. If it spread like paste, more flour or more working might be needed. If it became stiff and resistant, the baker had gone too far in the other direction. This is one of the parts modern sourdough culture is beginning to recover. A recipe provides a starting point. The dough gets the final vote. Once the sponge and flour came together, the quiet waiting ended. One documented 19th century method recommended roughly half an hour of forceful kneading. Another allowed the dough to be worked with 400 or 500 strokes of a chopping knife. The point was not ritual. Working the dough built the structure needed to trap the gas fermentation produced. Then the dough rose again. Historical bakehouse records describe a range of 2 to 5 hours depending on the strength of the yeast and the surrounding conditions. After shaping, the loaves received another rise in their pans. Every stage carried a risk. Dough that had not risen enough produced a heavy, damp loaf. Dough allowed to go too far could weaken, collapse, and turn excessively sour. Lard might be rubbed over the top to prevent a hard skin from forming while the loaf waited. The baker was managing living fermentation while also handling the rest of a frontier household. Water still had to be carried. Fuel still had to be cut. Children, animals, washing, meals. And fieldwork did not stop because the sponge was ready. Bread demanded attention on its own schedule, and the household had to bend around it. But a perfectly maintained starter, good flour, and properly risen dough still did not guarantee bread. The final judgment could destroy everything that came before it. There was no temperature dial waiting on the wall. The baker had to read fire, brick, air, and time well enough to know when an empty oven was ready. A masonry bake oven did not cook with a small fire left burning beneath the loaf. The fire was built inside the chamber or in a connected firebox to heat the brick, stone, or clay around it. When enough heat had been stored, the coals and ashes were removed. The hot masonry did the baking. That meant the baker had to manage 2 separate processes that happened to meet at the same moment. The dough had to finish rising just as the oven reached the proper heat. At Fort Scott, one recorded test was to throw a little flour into the oven and close the door for a minute. If the flour browned, the oven was ready. If it scorched black, the heat was described as too furious. The baker could open the oven to release heat or move a wet broom near the ceiling to cool it. Other bakers judged heat by how long a hand could tolerate the oven's opening, by the color of the masonry, or simply by experience with that particular oven. 2 ovens built from different materials did not behave identically. A newly heated oven could be stubborn. An oven used regularly held and released heat differently. The oven was another living variable in a process already full of them. Heating an oven consumed wood and time, so baking was commonly done in batches rather than one fashionable loaf at a time. At Pennsylvania's Hopewell Furnace, the bake oven could hold roughly 24 loaves. And baking was normally a weekly Friday or Saturday chore. The same ovens could also help dry apples, peaches, and corn. That economy shaped frontier baking. The hottest part of the cycle belonged to foods that needed strong heat. As the masonry cooled, other dishes or drying work could use what remained. A well-managed firing did not merely produce bread. It organized several meals and preservation jobs around one load of fuel. The scale changed from place to place. A household might bake only enough for a family. Forts and trading posts needed hundreds of loaves. At Fort Larned in 1868, approximately 275 soldiers meant at least 275 loaves each day. Fort Vancouver kept 3 or 4 bakers working long hours before massive twin ovens to feed company employees and travelers. Whether the oven served 6 people or 600, the principle was the same. Bread was not casual. It required flour, storage, leavening, water, fuel, timing, labor, and somebody capable of bringing all of them together. On a Nebraska homestead remembered by Phoebe May Hopper, her mother baked every Saturday and usually every Wednesday. As the children grew in number and appetite, baking increased to 3 times a week. That small detail tells more about frontier bread than a perfect surviving recipe ever could. Bread making was not a special event staged for nostalgia. It was recurring household maintenance. The starter needed feeding. The flour barrel needed watching. The wood box had to be filled before baking day. The oven and dough had to be coordinated with everything else. In many family households, women carried this knowledge. At military posts, soldiers rotated through bakery duty. In settled communities, professional bakers and millers took over part of the work. But wherever bread was made, skill remained visible in the result. A good loaf meant the fermentation, flour, dough, and fire had all been read correctly. That knowledge passed through repetition. A child learned the feel of dough by touching it. She learned the smell of a ripe sponge because the same crock was opened every week. He learned oven heat by watching flour brown on the hearth. The recipe mattered, but the repeated judgment around the recipe mattered more. Skill could also become income. After Bridget Degnan settled in Yosemite Valley in the 1880s, she supported her growing family by baking bread and meals for neighbors and visitors. She reportedly produced as many as 50 loaves a day in a household oven before the family built a larger bakery. Her story was not typical of every homestead, but it shows what competent bread making could become when a remote place began attracting more people. The household craft could grow into one of a settlement's first dependable businesses. The frontier bread system did not disappear all at once. Commercial yeast manufacturing expanded after 1870. By the 1890s, packaged yeast cakes were familiar to many American cooks. Roller mills produced wider, more consistent flour with a longer shelf life. Cook stoves and later ovens with temperature controls narrowed the amount of judgment required at the fire. By the 1920s, temperature dials were becoming standard. Each change solved a real problem. Packaged yeast was predictable. Standardized flour made recipes repeatable. A controlled oven wasted fewer loaves. Nobody should pretend that uncertainty, smoke, heavy kneading, and failed bread were superior simply because they were old. But convenience changed the location of the knowledge. The miller controlled the flour. The yeast company controlled the leaven. The stove controlled the heat. Eventually, the bakery and factory controlled the bread itself. Sourdough survived because some households never stopped, and because the starter remained useful wherever commercial yeast was inconvenient or unavailable. Over time, however, maintaining a culture became optional for most Americans. A household system became a specialty craft. That is what makes the present sourdough revival more than an internet curiosity. In the first 10 months of 2025 alone, YouTube videos with sourdough in the title received more than 500 million views. People are not merely looking for another kind of bread. Many are trying to recover the satisfaction of maintaining something living, reading it correctly, and producing food with judgment instead of pushing a button. The frontier baker would recognize the starter, the sponge, the waiting, and the failed loaves. She or he would probably be puzzled by the expensive equipment and the need to photograph the crumb. But they would understand why a person keeps returning to the crock. Sourdough did not feed the frontier because it was fashionable, ancient, or picturesque. It fed the frontier because ordinary people learned the whole system and kept it working week after week. Which part of that system would be hardest to recover today? Maintaining the starter, reading the dough, or controlling the oven by feel? Like, subscribe, and leave a comment, and we'll see you in the next one.